Welcome to the Organ Podcast from the Royal College of Organists with me, Mark O'Brien. Now, go and get your Cesar Franck music and listen carefully, because I talked to Richard Brasier about some of the startling discoveries he's made in his new 8-volume Franck edition. So hang on a minute, you're saying that the wrong manuscript went to the printers for the 3 chorales. We're playing the wrong version.
Yes.
That's terrible. And I might just have a world premiere of an unpublished work by Cesar Franck as well. Also coming up, I explore the Tickell organ at Manchester Cathedral with the man whose vision it was to put it there, Organist and Master of the Choristers, Christopher Stokes.
It has to answer so many demands. You know, it's got to play all the hymns, all the big carols at Christmas time. It's got to play Stanford in B flat and whatever. But can it play Bach? Can it play Couperin? Can it play Reger? They're the important things, I think, to answer. And then everything else will flow from that, is my belief.
For 5 years, Richard Brasier devoted his life to a forensic appraisal and re-evaluation of the organ and harmonium works of Cesar Franck, tracking down pretty much every available manuscript. Originally an edition aimed at marking the bicentennial of Franck's birth in 2022, his work has expanded to 8 volumes, the last of which were published earlier this year, featuring facsimiles, previously unpublished works, detailed descriptions of the organs played by Franck, and notes on performance practice. I met up with Richard at his church in London, which has a very fine Hauptwerk organ, conveniently running the sample set of the Cavaille-Coll organ at Saint-Étienne in Caen, which proved rather useful. So Richard, what have you done in your editions that haven't been done before?
Well, I think the important thing to do was to scrutinise as much of the original source material as possible and present everything as I find it in the sources, trying to be as objective as I possibly can, whilst at the same time presenting anything that may have been overlooked historically, whether that be poor analysis of a particular manuscript or a manuscript that's been hidden away in an archive somewhere for many, many years that we've not been able to study. I think it's fair to say that of all the Romantic composers, Cesar Franck has been the most underrepresented. We've had fantastic editions of Widor and Vierne in recent times, but nothing really that looks at the work of Cesar Franck and tries to unpick all of the ambiguities that have developed in the years since his death, and almost certainly during his lifetime as well.
Have we been playing Franck all wrong for the last 140 years?
No, I don't think we've been playing Franck in the wrong way. It's just that we've not really been able to go into as much detail as we probably would have liked. If you look at Cesar Franck's music, it is all very, very pianistic in its manner. I mean, if I just play the opening of Chorale number 1 here, it's piano music, really. Work wonderfully well at the piano. You could shape phrases, create all manners of expression. One of the details that I managed to unearth that's not really been considered in the past is this idea of spreading chords at the organ. Cesar Franck had very large hands.
I mean, how large were they? I can do about a tenth. You're nearly doing an 11th there.
Yes, I can manage between C and F. Cesar Franck would have gone up to G, certainly, maybe even A, if he was really, really stretching.
A 13th.
And this is just something that we simply can't do as mere mortals. Organists such as Louis Vierne were known to couple down to the pedals. They would take off all the pedal stops and they would play the bass part in the pedals, which is fine if you have really, really small hands. But Cesar Franck is known to have adapted his technique to different instruments. So if he went to an organ with a heavy action and it didn't quite match the needs of the particular passage he was playing, so for example, if he wanted to play something very, very legato, but the heavy action meant that was not possible. He could have done something like this. Spread the chords. And by doing this, it creates momentum through the passage to the highest point, and then relax.
And how did you find that out through looking through the manuscripts?
There is a book by Maurice Emmanuel, who was a contemporary of Cesar Franck, and he writes quite extensively on Franck's performing techniques. And
so he did, I mean, there's evidence Franck would have done that.
yes, absolutely.
And as you were saying, that kind of thing, it's not necessarily just because you might have smaller hands. You're saying actually he probably would have done that because arpeggiating the chords in that way, or those large gaps, gives momentum to the music. There's actually a musical benefit to this rather than a physical one.
Exactly. It adds character to the passage as well. If I was to play this passage using my own handspan without coupling to the pedals, I could probably manage something like this. So there are some breaks in the left hand. But it's a little bit heavy and clunky, but by spreading the chords, it adds a different dimension to the passage.
How difficult was all of this? How long did you take? How hard was it to find all of these manuscripts and actually decipher them? Because I'm right in thinking Franck doesn't really help you either in the way that he composes and makes his sketches.
No, I mean, from a composer's perspective, a manuscript only presents us with what the composer is thinking in that very moment. If you want to try and dig deeper and try and really unpick the thinking of a composer, it's important to try and understand the various practices of the time. So not just looking at editions of organ music, but by reading letters, looking at other documents, reading testimonials, reading newspaper articles.
Anecdotal evidence, social evidence, as well as what you can see by looking at scores and manuscripts.
Exactly. One needs to be very, very careful with anecdotal evidence. In music, sometimes it can feel like a game of Chinese whispers when you have students of a famous composer saying, this is exactly how they did it, therefore you must do it. And this is certainly the case with Marcel Dupré, for example. Even Nadia Boulanger claims to have first-hand knowledge of how Cesar Franck played, even though there is no overlap between them. And as a result of that, ideas and thoughts get skewed. Perhaps rather naively, we as organists pick up on these things and think, oh, Marcel Dupré said that. Very, very big name in the world of the organ. Therefore, we must take it at face value and do what he says. But I don't think that's correct. And if you look at Marcel Dupré's editions of not just Cesar Franck, but also Handel and Bach, there's very little sense that he's trying to be objective in his aims. There's no real critical thought. It's the music through the eyes of Marcel Dupré.
What you're doing here differently is you really are sort of almost archaeologically stripping things back. You're saying, having gone through all the layers of manuscripts and writing, this is what I think more faithfully represents Cesar Franck's intentions. Is that right?
Exactly. And this edition, one can use it on one's own. One can use it with a teacher. It can be used in all manner of different ways. And it's not meant to say this is exactly how things were done. It just presents all the information as it's found in the original source material. And then one can make one's own decision.
Were you looking for stuff that you knew existed somewhere, or did you discover things that had previously just been kept in somebody's drawer?
A lot of this stuff has been considered lost, simply because many of the prized manuscripts have been kept in private collections. But I found that just by asking nicely and asking around, people are willing to share these precious documents, with the aim of enhancing our knowledge.
I mean, for somebody who is so foundational in the organ repertoire in his own right, and then you add on to that, he's foundational in terms of, his approach to symphonic organ music, the romantic organ playing, isn't that remarkable that somebody like him has been neglected or insufficiently served to this extent?
Absolutely. I mean, Cesar Franck is a very, very important composer, whether you like his music or not. We have to respect the place that he has in the history of music, not just on the organ, but chamber music, piano music, choral music. If we didn't have the works of Cesar Franck, or indeed the work of Aristide Cavaillé-Coll, would we have had the works of Widor, Vierne, Messiaen, Duruflé?
I mean, he really is the father of that
Yes.
school of French music. Yes. Without Cavaillé-Coll, would we have Cesar Franck influencing us in the same way? I mean, is it an interesting relationship, really, of organ composer and organ builder?
I think it's the perfect marriage of the two. If we didn't have Cavaillé-Coll, would we have the works of Cesar Franck as we have them now? No, I don't think we would. Mm-hmm. You know, I think the two of them came together at just the right time.
But do we also have to be careful? Because speaking as an English perspective of always trying to create that French sound is a lot of what we do when playing his music and similar music of that period. We fall into the trap of trying to recreate the sound of a specific organ rather than read the intentions of the music.
To some degree, yes. We have to remember the organ at Santa Clotilde was very unique and was considered by Cavaillé-Coll to be his finest. So it's remarkable that it no longer exists in its original form. It had a very large grand orgue, a sizable positif, both of which were at the front of the case, and a small récit that was buried right at the back, and quite a large pedal division either side that was separated on either side of the case. A lot of the foundation sound came from the front of the organ. You have this large grand orgue, a secondary grand orgue in all but name with the positif, and then this small récit at the back. And this is why Cesar Franck saw it necessary to add the trompette with the oboe, for example. He used the oboe as a means of colouring the sound.
Is that Franck's own idea that we've just morphed into this is what you do if you're playing a French instrument? Or, I mean, is it uniquely Franck just because of the size of the Saint Clotilde organ, or is it something we always have to utilise when doing French music of that period?
This is something that's unique to Cesar Franck. It's not something you find in the music of Widor or Vierne. Vierne, who was organist at Notre Dame, had a large organ. Widor, organist at Saint-Sulpice, had a large organ, sizable récit divisions, and they would have had lots of foundation sound to call upon. Whereas Cesar Franck didn't have very much at all. There wasn't even a principal 8-foot on the récit at Santa Clotilde. So he would have added the oboe to embolden the sound, to add some colour, and when it comes to expression, you get this wonderful oboe sound cutting through. And then when you close the box, it just returns to that very warm foundation sound. And because the oboe is placed right at the back of the box, Franck saw it important to add the trompette for solo melodies. So whereas on larger organs or more modern instruments, where the trompette might be quite large on the récit, it is perfectly acceptable to use the trompette on its own. Of course, typically we all use the oboe with the trompette, and it works.
Was he generous with his registration markings? I mean, presumably they're mostly going to be at Saint Clotilde, perhaps the Trocadero, or are we still in the dark as actually, what he pulled out at which point?
Well, his registration markings are rather generic in places. I mean, there are moments where he does specify individual stops. Normally, he would write something like Ange grand orgue, Ange positif, Ange récit, which generally means reeds with foundation stops. On the Cavaillé-Coll organs, you would have two separate boxes, one for the foundations, of which the oboe was included, and then you'd have the reeds, so trompette, clairon, and upper work such as mixtures, 2-foot, maybe even a 4-foot preston. And when Franck writes Ange grand orgue, for example, in his scores, he doesn't necessarily mean just foundations and reeds. What he wants us to do is add upper work and mixtures as well. And if you look at some of his improvisation manuscripts, for example, he does specify use of the plein jeu, certainly when he's improvising versets. So Franck did use the mixture on the grand orgue a lot, and I'm absolutely certain that he would have used it as part of the overall grand chœur sound on the organ, i.e. full organ. There's one exception to that rule, and I think that's in Chorale 3, the opening registration, where Franck is very specific about pitches. Jeu de fons et jeu d'anche de 8 à tous les claviers. Franck asks for foundation stops and reeds at 8-foot pitch. He's very specific there. And this is thought to be because of the reeds at Santa Clotilde having a number of overtones to them, so they gave that sort of extra bite to the sound.
When you were doing all of this, what was the most startling discovery? I mean, did you just find, subtle differences in terms of phrasing or slurring, or were there jaw-dropping moments where notes were different, passages were different?
Well, from my perspective, editing this music was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, so going into very, very minute detail, searching out missing rests and slurs and the like, may not have necessarily been required, but I chose to go into that much detail simply because the chance to do this again may not have come along. But also, looking at the manuscripts, we've been able to unearth some unknowns, certainly, particularly in the chorales. Cesar Franck wrote 3 different manuscripts for each chorale. He wrote a first pencil sketch, he then wrote a first complete draft with registrations, and then a final fair copy.
Which goes to the publisher.
Would have thought goes to the publisher.
Yeah.
Cesar Franck was working on these fair copies when he died. And when Cesar Franck died, his son Georges Franck, who oversaw his musical legacy, went to Auguste Durand and said, "We have these chorales here, I think we should publish them." And when they were going through the manuscripts, they looked at all 3 manuscripts and saw that the first complete draft was the most complete. And that is because they have registrations in. It's very clear what the registrations should be. When you look at the fair copies, of course there are some registrations in, but Franck was too unwell to complete the manuscripts. And then he died, so couldn't quite finish them. And to the untrained eye, it would look like the first complete draft is the version that Franck would want to have published. And those are the versions that were published. And actually, if you do an analysis of the first complete draft against the final fair copy, you can see there are some noticeable differences, not just in the way that the manuscripts are presented by Franck. The first complete drafts are rather scruffy in the way they're written, whereas the final fair copies are beautifully handwritten. Some of Franck's finest calligraphy, actually, of all his manuscripts.
So hang on a minute, you're saying that the wrong manuscript went to the printers for the 3 chorales. We're playing the wrong version.
Yes.
That's terrible.
And
are you the first person to have just discovered this?
Well, I mean, these manuscripts have been seen by a select few people historically. Very few people have been able to see the chorale manuscripts in the flesh, and I've been lucky enough to be one of those people.
Well, can you point out some of the differences then? You've got the chorales in front of you. So
Yeah.
This is your edition that we're hearing. Are you able to sort of give a before and after? So sort of explain something that, I would be familiar playing with my usual editions, and now what you've discovered, how we should actually be playing it going forward.
Okay, so we've gone to chorale number 2 in B minor, and in bar 52 there is a note that was engraved incorrectly in the first edition. We have been typically playing it like this for many, many years. So the penultimate quaver, you have a C sharp in the right hand and a C sharp in the left hand. Now, this is because in the left hand, that penultimate quaver, Cesar Franck, in the first complete draft, failed to put in a natural at that moment. So the engraver thought, okay, fine, Franck hasn't written a natural in the left hand there, therefore he must have missed out a sharp in the right hand there, because to the engraver, that would have been a C sharp, looking at it at face value. But when you take Franck's final version and you change the left hand to a C natural and the right hand to a C natural, this is what you get.
So do it again, give me the one we're used to.
So, and this is the new version. And it's very, very clear. in the final manuscript that should be a C natural. If we go into chorale 3, there was a significant engraving error in bar 24 of the first edition. Bar 24, in the pedal part, the second crotchet beat was engraved as an F natural, whereas in all of the manuscripts it is an A natural. So this is the version we have in the first edition. So this is the version from the first edition.
That's what we're used to.
That's what we're used to.
Yep,
and this is the version familiar. In Franck's 2 manuscripts.
So this is now your new edition. We're going to hear the difference.
Yes.
Well, straight away the pedal.
Yeah.
Very noticeable.
Very noticeable. And in all of the manuscripts, actually, it is a very clear A natural.
I mean, the problem is now you've got to be a brave person to play that in a recital today, because unless people are now familiar with your new edition, if you play that, people will think, oh, hang on a minute, he's
playing a wrong note.
Playing a wrong note in the pedals. What's going on? What do you do with that now?
Well, this is what's so great about scholarship, is that you can find these little details and correct them. And it acts as the catalyst for discussion amongst people. If you go to a concert and hear the A natural, and someone asks you, well, you can explain to them why it is an A natural.
The wrong manuscript went to the printer.
Yes, that's exactly how it is. Nothing more, nothing less.
So in the course of your research, did you actually discover anything brand new? I mean, is there a possibility that there was some undiscovered work by Cesar Franck?
Yes, so in 2023, a work came up for auction, an unpublished harmonium work called Andante et Prière, and I went along and was fortunate enough to be able to acquire it.
And how much did you pay for it, can I ask?
This item, along with some other things as well, came to around €10,000.
Wow. And it's his own hand?
It's his own handwriting. It's the only manuscript of this piece, and it was composed as a gift for a lady called Esther de Romilly, who may well have been one of his harmonium, organ or piano students. And if you'd like, I can play some of it to you.
Can I say this might be a premiere? Is this the first time we've heard it?
Could well be. I don't know of any recordings of this piece as yet, so we can safely assume that this could well be the first recording of this piece.
Right, we've got it. So it's for harmonium. Are you going to be able to play it on the organ?
No, Franck was very specific that the organ and harmonium were treated as separate instruments. So for this, I think we'll go to the piano.
Really? It would be against Franck's nature for you to play that?
Well, the harmonium is a very expressive instrument, as is the piano, whereas the organ can be rather harsh.
Right. Well, let's do it. If we can go over to the piano,
Yeah,
this is very exciting.
So this work is in 3 sections. The first section is completely new material. We then see 2 examples of Franck reusing earlier material from his organ works. The second section is an arrangement of a petit offertoire in C minor for organ. And then at the conclusion, we have a lovely surprise, which I'll share with you when we get to it.
How do you feel? I mean, you're holding it now. I mean, it's obviously old yellowed paper. It's over a century old. But, you know, this is the pencil. This is the workings out of Cesar Franck. How do you feel just holding this and having it in front of you and about to play something that, you know, hasn't been heard?
It's quite remarkable to think that at one time Franck was sitting in front of this piece of paper. He touched this paper. He wrote on this paper.
Yeah.
The ideas that he was formulating in his mind are manifest here in this manuscript.
Well, look, if you can play it, that's really exciting. So, kind of for the first time, we're going to hear Andante et Prière by Cesar Franck.
petit offertoire. So on and so forth. And then, at the end of the petit offertoire, we have something rather special, which many listeners may well be familiar with. The final passage from the Fontaine for organ, arranged for harmonium. And so on and so forth. This is a very late composition, which is likely to have been composed around the time that he was writing his works for harmonium. I mean, this will be one of many examples, I'm sure, that are yet to be discovered.
But lovely that he held on to that theme, so many years later, the theme for that fantasy, yes, he's still using in other work.
And this has the most beautiful conclusion as well.
Well, I'll let you conclude it. Richard Brasier, thank you very much. Let's hear then the end of this work. This is Christopher Stokes playing Buxtehude's Toccata in F major on the Tickell organ at Manchester Cathedral. Chris has been organist and master of the choristers here for over 30 years and was instrumental in the installation of this new organ onto the choir screen in 2016. Well, the earliest known organ at Manchester Cathedral was built in 1684 by Father Smith, which lasted well into the 19th century when it was moved to make way for a new 3-manual Nicholson organ in 1861. But barely 10 years later, another organ arrives, built by William Hill, and this is subsequently enlarged and rebuilt in the early 1900s by Harrison and Harrison. But disaster struck in 1940, when the cathedral was bombed in an air raid during the Second World War. And so a new organ was built by Harrison's in the 1950s, but hidden out of sight in cabinets on the north and south aisles behind the choir. And that was it, until 8 years ago, when it was all thrown out to make way for a new instrument built by the Northampton firm of Kenneth Tickell. I went along to the cathedral to meet Christopher Stokes at the console to find out what his vision was when planning for this new organ. Well, Chris, not only did you put a brand new organ in here, but you completely changed the appearance of this cathedral by reinstating an organ case back onto the choir screen, probably for the first time in, I think, in about 80 years. What made you think you had to go to all of these lengths rather than just restore the Harrison organ that was already here?
Well, it was never the greatest instrument, I'm afraid. It was very much a kind of a psalm machine rather than an instrument that was built for the repertoire. And also it was hidden away in boxes in the side aisles, the choir aisles, and the sound really never travelled out into the main space of the nave. And so I think that was the opportunity for us to do something really imaginative and get the organ back onto the screen again, as was until 1940 when the incendiary bomb dropped on the Ely Chapel, which is now the Regiment Chapel. And this was our big golden opportunity.
When you're in the lucky position you were in to basically build an organ from scratch, you weren't limited by having to match an existing tonal design or use pipes that are already there. Where do you start?
Well, I suppose you start with thinking organically, which of course the Harrison didn't really have an organic integrity of its own. It was very much a collection of sound, and some of the sounds, I have to say, very, very beautiful. But you kind of had to know how to use the organ to make it really effective. So we went back to the first principles of building choruses. So the principal chorus on the great, the principal chorus on the positive, being the two, really essential manuals for the essential repertoire from the Baroque period. And then adding to that the swell organ, and then of course the solo organ, which has all the beautiful colours.
But where do you do the balance? I mean, when you're sitting there, I assume with a blank piece of paper, thinking, right, what stops shall I have? How many of them shall I have? In your mind, is there a way where you have to balance the accompanimental role of this being a cathedral organ to accompany the choir, or as a repertoire organ?
Yes, that's a very good point. I believe that you should start from the repertoire point of view, because if you can play the repertoire, then actually you can play the accompaniments as well without any trouble. But if you work the opposite way round, where you have beautiful accompanimental instrument, but actually it doesn't answer the questions for the main repertoire of the German Baroque, the French Baroque, incredibly important repertoire. And so we've got all the right sounds on both the great and the positif for doing that.
I mean, do you think that's something that's missing from a lot of perhaps cathedral organs, that a comprehensive chorus design on all keyboards?
I think that's the case sometimes, but I think what I would say it is actually the organic growth from the fundamental sound through to the mixtures, where the next octave is linking in tonally through the harmonics to create a sort of a proper unity of sound. So it doesn't become 5 or 6 separate sounds, it becomes one sound. And that's important when you're talking about the tierce en taille on the positif. If we were to draw the bourdon, the Spitz flute, the nasade, the open flute, the tierce, the larigot, we've got a lot here. There's one sound. It's not a whole series of sounds.
And you've also gone for a lot of 8-foots though here, haven't you? I mean, there you've got about 4 or 5 on the great. Is this intentionally quite 8-foot heavy as well, even though you're talking about the principal chorus going up in its usual way? You have a lot of other 8-foot sounds.
Yes, it's a very warm instrument, because on the great, we've got the stop diapason, which is lovely. We've also got a whole flute, which can be used in chorus and in solo. We've got a wonderful cone gamba, which is almost like a third diapason. And so you can start to put them together. And then the 4-foot flute to add on to the top. So yes, I didn't want something that was going to be sort of arid in sound. I wanted something that was going to be really warm, and so I suppose that explains all the 8-foot stops.
And why Kenneth Tickell? What was the reason behind going for him in particular to make this organ?
Well, I suppose it was my belief that actually I wanted an English organ builder to build this fantastic instrument. A lot of people do go abroad for their instruments, and they are amazingly fantastic. But I think an English organ or a British organ answering all the questions of the repertoire would be the right thing to do if we possibly can in an English cathedral. And also by choosing Ken Tickell, Ken was an organist himself. He was a fully qualified organist with FRCO. He understood entirely what the repertoire was all about. And therefore we were talking the same language right from the very beginning, which was, it just short-circuited so many things and made things easier.
Is there an English flavour that you think you've captured as a result of that makes this instrument stand out even more?
I suppose when it comes to the swell organ, maybe there with the strings. And I suppose this sort of instrument has to be eclectic. It has to answer so many demands. It's got to play all the hymns, all the big carols at Christmas time. It's got to play Stanford in B flat and whatever from that repertoire. But again, I go back to, can it play Bach? Can it play Couperin? Can it play Reger? They're the important things, I think, to answer. And then everything else will flow from that, is my belief.
We're in the nave, we're on the mobile console down in the nave, looking up at a fabulous case,
isn't it?
Of the choir screen.
Yeah.
And it's worth saying that the console you've got here is interesting as well, because you've modelled it on, to me it looks like a Cavaille-Coll type of organ. You've got the stops going horizontally. And was that your idea as well?
Well, yes, I did want that from the very beginning, because we've got 81 speaking stops plus all the couplers. And if, therefore, you have an instrument that goes upwards in the normal English fashion, it would be huge if one thinks about the Liverpool mobile console. Now, in Liverpool, of course, it's fine. It's lost in that vast barn of a place. But here, this is a much, much smaller building. And I wanted something that would be lower, but also that the French design is a fantastic way of having a console anyway.
Well, let's hear some of the sounds, because you said when you were designing this organ, when you were thinking of the stops, you were going for your principal foundations to begin with. So where is the principal heart of this organ for you?
Okay, so, we would start, therefore, with the 8-foot principal, the 8-foot diapason. This is on the grate. On the grate, yes. And then adding the 4-foot onto it. And followed by the 2-foot on that side. And then the full mixture. And then the sharp mixture as the last one. So there you have a real principal chorus building up. So it's organically thought through. And
it's crisp, though. We think of English cathedral sounds. There are lots of thick, warm, woolly diapasons in a way. This, to my mind, does when you're talking about Baroque, Bach-type repertoire. Am I right? This is the clarity that you were wanting?
Absolutely right. But also a warmth of singing sound. So that, for example, on the West... That just gently sings and underpins everything.
Now, when you said west, are we talking that the organ case, because it's a double case, it points west and east?
Yes.
It speaks in different directions. You've got stops different sides. Is that kind of how the tonal scheme works here?
Well, yes, but often instruments that are built on the screen will be difficult on one side and maybe difficult on another. But Ken had this fantastic idea of turning it through, as I understand it, through 90 degrees. So actually, the stops speak really well both sides.
Sort of north to south in that case.
North to south, yes. But we also do have an east diapason as well, which speaks into the choir. It is very beautiful sound, yes.
But you did do a specific design, because you've got, if I'm right, the choir faces into the choir. You've got a separate positive division that faces west down here into the nave, is that right?
Indeed so. So we have the positive manual plays both the choir and the positive. So we've got a full complement in the choir itself. So again, there is a proper principal chorus starting from, it's pitched in 4. So again, we have a full organic chorus.
And that's speaking east, that's away from us, the other side of the screen.
And it's actually quite punchy in the choir itself. We can use it, delightfully so, we can use it as an echo in the nave. A very, very sweet-sounding flute, which is a very useful echo. And we can actually do the same in the choir. We can use the positive flute in the choir as a kind of an echo, and it works very well.
Well, you're talking about how the different styles is important here, particularly playing couperin, the French classical music. Can you give me an idea of how this sounds when you're putting a French flavour over it?
Yes, absolutely. Because if we look at the full mixture chorus, is essentially going to give you a plangeur sound. But so that answers the plangeur. But on the converse, we have to think about the grandeur, which is the other big sound. And if we therefore pull out a 4-foot principal, poussin, and we've got a mounted cornet.
This is all on the grate still?
This is all on the grate, yes. So there. And you get that very bright.
Different,
it's
isn't it?
Absolutely wonderful. And then if we wanted to, we could add the 4-foot reed from the swell, and that would just brighten it up even further. And then just underpin it even more with some 16 sounds. So that's very realistic, I think, in terms of a grandeur.
But when you are doing the day job, and it's Psalm 46, where are those? Have you got the warm, undulating tones that sort of can hide behind the choir or accompany it and support it?
Yeah, absolutely. We've got just pulling out the swell strings with maybe even the 32-foot flue that goes with it. So. We've got a 16/8/4 reeds there, so the swell trumpet, and then the clarion, and then the 16 to go with it. There's quite a lot of clatter in that sound, which is very successful in French music and in German music, I think.
You've got to be on your mettle playing here, because it's a largish building, but it's not much of a reverb. You're quite exposed in how you play here. You can't hide behind a reverb to that extent, can you?
Completely, yes. It can be quite scary. You've really got to know what you're doing, because, as you say, you can't hide anywhere in the reverb. So it's all quite dry. I suppose we measured it as about 2 seconds absolute maximum.
And did it reduce when you put the organ back on the screen? So effectively you've cut the cathedral in half in many ways. Did that dry it up to what it was when you had the old Harrison in boxes round the side?
Well, it's a curious thing, but just before we had the new organ, we closed for about 8 months and we had a brand new floor. The quality of the floor is harder, I think, than the previous one, and it actually gave us a little bit more reverberance, which is very curious.
But I suppose from a voicing point of view as well, you've really got to be very focused and clear, because again the organ speaks directly at you. So it's interesting, you can't voice and the pipes are miles away. You are facing the organ wherever you are in this building.
That's quite true, and it has a clarity throughout the whole building. You can hear everything that's going on in the counterpoints. It was voiced in the nave, so there's nothing muffled. And of course it was very muffled when it was in the horrible brown boxes that were around the side. You couldn't really tell what was going on.
Now, how innovative did Tickell have to be with this? Because although you've got most of it up on the screen, there's not enough room for the whole organ. Am I right in thinking there's a bit of hybrid? You've got mechanical action when you're up there. Some of it is electric action. How does that work?
Right. Okay. So because the bottom keyboard has two departments, they can't be both mechanical because that's a physical impossibility.
So that's the positive and the choir.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. So the positive is on mechanical action. The choir is on electric action because it's just on the other side. The other part of the electric action is a solo organ with all the colours, but also over in the Jesus Chapel are the big 32s, the flues and the reeds, and they are from the Harrison organ because there was simply no point in trying to buy a complete set of 32s. It would be a complete waste of money, and they're really good quality anyway.
But the solo is new, is that right?
The solo, more or less new, but the French horn is one that is that is from the old organ, completely reconstructed and cleaned, etc., etc. The tuba, which is not the tuba magna that Norman Cocker knew, but he did know this one, but again, it's had to be remodeled. It's a very, very bright sounding tuba.
Gosh, it is.
And we've also got a little 4-foot brother to go with it, which is brand new.
And where actually has the old organ gone?
Well, David Wells looked after the pipework and took that away. But the console is now in Selby Abbey and has been remodelled. You wouldn't quite recognise it except for the curved jambs. I believe that was the first example of its kind.
Well, let's get back to the organ here, the solo. Give us some of the colours that you've got here. And the solo that's not on the screen, if I'm right, that's down on the south side in its own chest, is that right?
Yes, it has its own case, so it's a proper organ, and it has swell louvers which point down into the nave and also into the choir. It's quite sort of well voiced in terms of volume, and so it's been voiced again in the nave, so we have to be very careful how we use it in the choir because it is quite an impact. So it has a rather beautiful clarinet, which again is a new one. It also has a cor anglais. It has an oboe. Which is quite a contrast, actually, to the swell oboe, which is a little bit more throaty. So, it's nice to have the options of style. It has a lovely harmonic flute. Which is pure gold. And a 4-foot brother again.
And I see you've got a 4-foot fagura. I've never heard of that. What is it?
Yes, I was slightly surprised by that one. It is like a thin principal sound. So that can go with the solo strings, which are a little bit more, I suppose one could say, a little bit more French, perhaps, than the English sort of sounding strings on the swell. We've also got the old contraviole from the solo organ from the Harrison, and that goes very nicely with the other strings.
You're talking about wanting, French and German style and then the English style. Do you think it's possible to have all three of those on one organ?
Yes, it's very greedy, really. But, I suppose what I go back to saying is that it is an eclectic instrument. And I suppose if you're going to be absolutely purist, okay, it doesn't sound like a Schnitger, it doesn't sound like a Cavaillé-Coll, but, it comes pretty near. You can play the repertoire successfully.
You're really happy this is, I guess, for you, a legacy for many generations to come of what you've done here.
Well, I think so. And the quality of the craftsmanship inside, the way it's been built, the quality is absolutely second to none. I mean, the case is remarkable. There are two sides to the case. There's the nave side, which is quite a modern design with some absolutely beautiful lettering.
Yes, you've got sort of calligraphy moulded in relief over the the usual pipe shapes of the case, which is novel.
It's absolutely beautifully done. I wasn't convinced, but I was wrong. And John Pritchard, our wonderful architect of the time, was absolutely right. And between he and Ken, they designed the case. But on the other side, on the choir side, it's a much more traditional case and painted gold pipes rather than the tin on the nave side. And if you approach from the outside in Victoria Street and the west door is open, you can see this organ through the door, and it is absolutely breathtaking. It really is. I mean, I've seen it virtually every day, and I'm still breathtaken by how beautiful it is.
Well, Chris, thanks ever so much for doing this. Have you got something you can play that, as far as you're concerned, can show the full range of the character of this organ?
Yes, well, the piece I'd like to play is the chorale by Jongen. It was his anniversary last year, and I think it does show off all the various colours. It builds from quite a quiet sound on the swell and builds to absolute tutti by the end with a 32-foot reed doing its stuff on the last few bars.
Well, Chris, thanks ever so much. Thank you very much indeed.
It's been my pleasure.
Well, barely 30 miles west of Manchester Cathedral, you'll find Liverpool Cathedral, and that's where I'll be in the next episode with the cathedral's organist, Professor Ian Tracy, where he'll be demonstrating the organ and its new echo division, which will be heard in public for the first time as part of the cathedral's 98th anniversary organ recital on October the 19th. And I'll also be talking to Jeremiah Stevenson, the organ education lead at St Paul's Cathedral, to find out how he is introducing the organ to young people. So until then, from me, Mark O'Brien, goodbye.